So where did baptism come from? Like, why did we think to use water as this symbolic act? Well, it goes far past the New Testament into the Old Testament, and in fact, it's covered all over the place in Scripture, but sometimes in ways we don't quite think of. The number one thing we have to remember is that this is not one book. This is multiple books, 66 to be precise, separated in two main categories: the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and it was written over the course of about 1,500 years, give or take. And you've got the New Testament, which starts at the time of Christ and then goes all the way into the time of the disciples. And that's written primarily in Greek. So when we look at Scripture and we see common threads and themes, these are different authors weaving in stories and analogies and ideas and concepts, examples, so that we can see something, right? We're trying to describe spiritual things that are transcendent beyond our world, but all we have to pull from are things within our world. So we use analogy and concept and idea. And so when we look at Scripture, we need to look for these kind of patterns that emerge in it, where you may see one author over here using this idea, for us, water. And then you may read a little bit further and see another author using the idea of water. And in fact, a third one using the same idea from the two and pulling them together. And that's purposeful. It's not by accident that we can see that pattern kind of emerging, because the authors are reading each other, if you will, over time, and they're weaving a story together to try to help us understand one core truth of who God is and Christ and what he came to do. And so when we look at Scripture, that's how we need to kind of look at it, and to say there's the concept, there's a pattern that will emerge and does emerge out of this. And it's commonly referred to as the unity of Scripture. You looked at some of that in your notes yesterday, of the idea of the unity of Scripture, that we know it's been kind of placed together to illustrate to us these points. And so what we're going to do is look at a pattern that we see emerge from the very beginning. And you will see over the course of this entire journey how true this pattern gets unfolded and deepened and more and more and more. And so we're going to kind of take a broad stroke for a moment through the Old Testament, kind of where that one of the sides of baptism comes from, because we're going to do this 2 or 3 times, where we go back to the Old Testament and look at one analogy of baptism, or the idea of God saving his people through water. Because after all, that's what we're talking about, right? We're doing this physical act of immersion into water and coming up out of it. And it's this symbolic act of somehow God is saving us through water. So where did we get that idea from? Well, let's go all the way back to the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 1. Let's read Genesis chapter 1 together here, just right at the first part of it. And it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, 'Let there be light.' And the evening and the morning were the first day." And so when we see, and God said, "Let there be light," and we see his face was covering, or his spirit was covering the darkness, or the deep, the waters there, the abyss, we see right here off the cuff that somehow or another God takes deep, dark waters, chaotic waters, and he brings life up out of it. Are we already starting to see a little bit of symbolic nature? We should be. How about let's go to another story. Let's go to Noah. The story of Noah is in Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 8. And in this story, what do we see? We see God saving Noah and his family in an ark. And there's some interesting things in there in your notes about that. But saving Noah and his family in an ark. And what is it? It talks about the turbulence of the storm and the waters coming up. And actually, there's a lot of connection to the Genesis story of how God separates the waters. And in the story of Noah, how the waters become all back one again. It's like a de-creation almost happening there. And then God, what does he do? He saves his people. He saves Noah and his family in an ark through chaotic waters. How about Moses? We have Moses in the book of Exodus, probably one of the most well-known stories in Scripture. And we have Moses. Well, how does Moses get saved from the slaughter and the things that is happening of the children? He gets put in a basket, and he gets put down the tumultuous Nile River, and he is saved out of it. And there's an interesting little connection there of what Moses is in, that little wicker vessel, kind of like an ark, that he is then saved out of the waters and comes out. How about that's in Exodus chapter 2 that we see that. Now, how about in Exodus 14? Exodus chapter 14. what happens here? This is after the plagues of Egypt. And we see Moses and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. They get to the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. And what? They cross over the sea in dry land. And their salvation is had on the other side of that river. So here we're seeing this pattern. God takes tumultuous, crazy, chaotic waters of death, waters that stop you, right? And he delivers his people through the water. Joshua, we have another one, about what? They're 40 years in the desert. They're wandering around in the wilderness there, and God instructs them. This is in Joshua chapter 3. God instructs them to say, carry the Ark of the Covenant, different type of ark, but carry the Ark of the Covenant with the priest, carry it across the Jordan River. It says, go across the Jordan River, and whatever happens to the Ark and the priest will happen for all the people, and they cross over on dry land. We even see Isaiah give a prophecy and a metaphor in Isaiah where he talks about this after tons of failed kings and monarchs and things like that. What we see is Isaiah saying there will be a king priest that comes, or a Messiah that comes and will deliver his people. And he starts using language. He starts using words, examples that we see from Genesis and from Noah and from Moses and Joshua. And so here are just some of the major areas that we see this concept, this idea of God saving his people through waters, bringing them out of tumultuous, dark, chaotic waters, and it's deliverance that comes on the other side of that. Now here's just a broad stroke, because this kind of starts to paint the picture of one of the concepts of baptism, which is from death to life. There's another concept of cleansing that we're going to get onto later in this. So this is just kind of the very basic foundation stones of where we start to gather some of these ideas of using water to represent a spiritual rebirth, a spiritual deliverance, a spiritual salvation, and physical water being an example of that. And now in your notes, there's some very good details about those stories that I just said. So at the end of this video, take a moment, read through that, look at some of those scriptures and those verses, and let it kind of paint that picture a little bit broader. Now, next, we're going to look at the New Testament and how does baptism kind of transition in this same way in the New Testament.